Hello again, everybody. So for this week's first video, what we're going to look at is the Americanization, if you will, of the war in Vietnam. And so we're going to kind of look at that process starting in 1964 in the aftermath of the Gulf of Tonkin incident of how the United States transforms the conflict in Vietnam into an American conflict, how American political and military planners sought to fight the conflict, their goals, and we'll look at how ultimately those goals end up creating a public relations and media issue that increasingly will drive opposition to the war. So a lot of stuff to unpack. So I guess the best place to start is where we left off with the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. Now, again, in the aftermath of that North Vietnamese patrol boat attack, or I should say, one actual North Vietnamese patrol boat attack and one alleged attack that, in all likelihood, never actually happened, President Johnson is given a virtual blank check by Congress to conduct war in Southeast Asia, in Vietnam specifically, with the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, a resolution granting him powers to wage war so vast that Johnson himself said in his typically, we'll call it colorful manner, it's like Granny's nightshirt. It covers everything. Now, initially, after Johnson is given basically carte blanche by Congress with the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, he doesn't immediately transform the war in Vietnam into an American war. Initially, his response is to launch a series of airstrikes against targets in North Vietnam, which proved to be very popular with the American people. And in the run-up to the 1964 presidential election, initially pledges not to send American troops to fight in Vietnam, stating, this isn't a war for the United States. I don't want American boys dying for a war that Asian boys should be fighting for themselves. Again, Johnson being Johnson, basically. So he initially, tries to send a message this is not going to be an American war in that sense, other than, air support and what have you. But within a matter of months, most notably within a few months of him winning re-election in one of the biggest landslides in American political history, Johnson's tone and his actions on Vietnam shift rather dramatically. This actually starts pretty shortly after he is inaugurated for re-inaugurated in January of 1965. Now, by this point, the situation in South Vietnam had deteriorated quite substantially. As I mentioned previously, the efforts to stabilize Vietnam by overthrowing Ngo Dinh end up backfiring rather spectacularly. And rather than bringing stabilization to the country by overthrowing an unpopular tyrant, Diem's overthrow actually throws Vietnam even further into chaos, with more than a dozen governments rising and falling, coup after counter coup and counter coup after counter coup, within a relatively rapid period of time. There's more than a dozen new governments that form in South Vietnam between November of 1963 and the end of 1965. So this is a very unstable period for South Vietnam, and that coincides with a dramatic increase in the ante of the war from North Vietnam. The flow of supplies, Russian and Soviet-made supplies, Soviet and Chinese-made supplies, making their way into South Vietnam via the Ho Chi Minh Trail, increases substantially in 1964 and early 1965. And by early 1965, it appears that North Vietnam is on the verge of winning the conflict, with Viet Cong forces overrunning much of the countryside outside of large cities like Da Nang and Saigon in South Vietnam. And so to this end, in February of 1965, under the advice of the commander of American forces in South Vietnam, the commander of the Army's command structure there, known as MACV, General William Westmoreland, as well as under the guidance of Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, a former Ford Motor executive who had been, during World War II, one of the chief architects of the final bombing campaign against Japan in the Pacific. McNamara and Westmoreland, working very closely together with one another, devised a strategy for American victory in Vietnam. Now, both Westmoreland and McNamara are driven by this almost fanatical belief that numbers can explain everything, and there's a mathematical formula, a quantitative way of measuring pretty much anything. And this is the approach that they adopt to conducting the war in Vietnam. Vietnam is, of course, not a traditional war. It's not a war against a major state actor in the way that World War II had been. It's not a war that is going to be measured in terms of, cities liberated or villages taken or, miles of territory advanced or what have you, like in World War II or in Korea. Instead, this is going to be a war that is going to be measured by rather obscure, some might even say, um, excessively quantitative measures for determining victory. You can't determine victory the way you can in a traditional war in Vietnam because you are, of course, fighting against an insurgency that exists around and amongst the very population that you are ostensibly tasked with defending. So that makes it a very difficult war to measure victory with. And so ultimately, Westmoreland and McNamara will develop quantitative, numerical, statistic driven methods of determining American victory in the war that, in and of themselves, will become very controversial and which will, in the long run, lead to a substantial credibility gap, as it comes to be known, between official pronouncements coming out of Westmoreland's headquarters or out of the Secretary of Defense and what people increasingly witness in their living rooms. Now, the principal focus early on in this period, as the war becomes Americanized, is an aerial campaign. As mentioned previously in discussion of World War II, air power had, of course, been a vital component to American and Allied victory over both Nazi Germany and Japan during the Second World War. The US and British led strategic bombing campaign against Germany had been incredibly effective in hampering that country's war making capacity and had dramatically accelerated the pace of Nazi defeat during World War II. And so it's not surprising that there was a similar belief in 1965 that air power, an American launched air campaign, could prove to be the the tipping point, the thing that would effectively tip the scales of victory in South Vietnam. And so, to that end, in February of 1965, President Johnson authorizes this massive aerial bombardment campaign against targets in both North Vietnam and South Vietnam, dubbed Operation Rolling Thunder. The rolling came from the fact that it was designed to be a gradually intensifying, gradually escalating bombing campaign that would grow in intensity and lethality with each passing month. And so, starting in February of 1965, large fleets of American aircraft, Air Force bombers, planes flying off the decks of Navy carriers begin performing massive numbers of missions over the skies of both North and South Vietnam. Now, in the end, Operation Rolling Thunder, this massive aerial bombardment campaign, would prove to be, in spite of the fact that the U.S. would drop more ordnance on Vietnam than it dropped on both Germany and Japan in all of World War II combined, it would end up being a massive failure and end up costing a massive amount in terms of aircraft shot down and in lives lost. And there's a number of reasons why Rolling Thunder ultimately failed this aerial campaign ultimately failed as a means of bringing the North Vietnamese to heel and bringing the war to a decisive conclusion. The first reason is Johnson himself. Much as had been in the case with his war on poverty and his domestic programs, Johnson was inspired by the examples of his predecessor of FDR, who, of course, had successfully prosecuted that war effort against Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan during World War II. But once again, unlike FDR, um, Johnson didn't have quite the stomach to go as far as those campaigns had gone. Much as had been in the case with Johnson's economic program, he opted for a more middle of the road approach rather than the kind of radical measures that probably would have truly granted him some chance of success. Johnson was deeply fearful that if the American bombing campaign killed massive numbers of North Vietnamese civilians, it would, of course, make the U.S. look, and indeed would, in fact, make it a country committing war crimes. And so he was very weary about launching bombing attacks that would produce mass civilian casualties. They ended up happening anyway, just as a virtual result of the nature of the combat. But so Johnson was worried about massive civilian casualties, and so he was very determined to impose strict limits on the American bombing campaign. Another part of this concern was also Johnson's worry that if an American bomb inadvertently made its way into, say, a North Vietnamese air base and happened to hit a radar or anti-aircraft installation or a fighter jet, and there was a Soviet or Chinese advisor. There were more than 300,000 Chinese advisors in serving in North Vietnam during the duration of the Vietnam War at its height between 1964 and 1968. Johnson feared that this would lead to an escalation of the war, a widening of the war, if you will. And so, to that end, Johnson imposed very strict rules of engagement on what American pilots could and could not bomb in North Vietnam. He even boasted, stating, "They can't bomb so much as an outhouse without my permission." So Johnson imposes very strict rules of engagement on American bombers that severely limit what targets they are and are not allowed to engage in. It creates rules of engagement that are very favorable to the North Vietnamese, who are, of course, defending their own airspace, and who very rapidly amass a massive number of surface-to-air missiles and anti-aircraft weapons that make the airspace over North Vietnam's capital, Hanoi, the most heavily defended on planet Earth at the time period. And as a result, they're able to shoot down large numbers of American planes and kill large numbers or take captive large numbers of American pilots without suffering much meaningful damage to their war-making infrastructure. Which brings me to a second reason why the air campaign against North Vietnam ultimately failed, which is that North Vietnam was, to use Johnson's own terms, a raggedy-ass fourth-rate power. They didn't have any industry. Germany and Japan during World War II, lots of industry, lots of things to bomb and attack, and destroy that can severely impact their ability to prosecute a war effectively. Vietnam didn't have that. All of its weapons, all of its rifles, all of its anti-aircraft guns, all of its machine guns were imported from the Soviet Union or from China. And because the United States refused to mine the ports surrounding North Vietnam, particularly the port of Haiphong, the supply of those weapons was virtually unimpeded by the American bombing campaign. And again, because of the rules of engagement imposed by Johnson over North Vietnam, those targets that were of military value in North Vietnam oftentimes were very severely restricted, if not outright off limits to American pilots. So there's two of the reasons right there: the strict rules of engagement in North Vietnam, the lack of any meaningful industry in North Vietnam to destroy with an aerial campaign, and then there's other concerns as well. Another reason why the air campaign over Vietnam failed, beyond the fact that um, there's no industry to speak of to destroy, so there's very few actual targets that have any real value. Um, and then those few that do exist are severely limited to American pilots. Another factor that contributes to the general failure of the air campaign over Vietnam is that it was designed, much as the air war over Germany and Japan, to break civilian morale, and it didn't. In fact, as the American air campaign intensified and as civilian casualties, in spite of Johnson's efforts, steadily crept up, the resolve of the people of North Vietnam, rather than withering, actually intensified. So again, it falls far short of its stated aims. Um, but then finally, I think most importantly, the reason why the American bombing campaign failed is because and this is where we get to some of the real perversities of the basic strategy in Vietnam. Um, that very strict limitation on rules of engagement that existed in North Vietnam, north of the 17th parallel, north of the DMZ, did not exist at all in the country that the United States was tasked with defending, in South Vietnam. Quite the opposite. In fact, in South Vietnam, much of the country had been labeled as what was referred to as a free fire zone, meaning that American pilots could basically drop ordnance wherever they wanted to and wherever it was deemed necessary in South Vietnam. And so so much of the American bombing campaign ends up concentrating in South Vietnam. And as a result, millions of people are displaced, and hundreds of thousands, if not millions, are killed as a result of a bombing campaign that was designed to protect them and to, prevent their country from falling to communism. And so, of course, what that does, this massive displacement, the massive civilian casualties that the American bombing campaign and the kind of, free range, free fire zone conditions that exist in South Vietnam promote, is that in fact large numbers of people who were either, you know, apathetic or neutral about, the Viet Cong and the NVA and or anything like that, they begin actively, siding with these people and seeing the United States as an enemy. So those are some of the big reasons why the air campaign failed. Now, the air campaign eventually isn't just the campaign in Vietnam isn't just limited after a not so long period of time to just an air campaign. It starts out as an exclusively air campaign. But by the summer of 1965, it intensifies into something considerably bigger than that. Initially, the American campaign in Vietnam consisted primarily, exclusively of this aerial campaign. And there were small numbers of American troops that began to be sent to Vietnam starting in early 1965, initially to defend American air bases like Da Nang and Pleiku and various other places like that. But as the American air offensive intensifies, and as much of the South Vietnamese countryside comes under American air power, the destructive influence of American air power, the insurgency intensifies. The Viet Cong and the NVA begin launching attacks on American air bases. And so General Westmoreland begins requesting more and more Americans to defend those air bases, but also to begin engaging in a strategy that is variously referred to either as pacification or search and destroy to eradicate the Viet Cong strongholds in South Vietnam. And so basically what happens at this point is by the summer of 1965, what initially started as an aerial campaign over the skies of North Vietnam becomes something much bigger. Increasing numbers of American soldiers and Marines are being sent to South Vietnam with the explicit purpose of going beyond their initial mission of protecting those air bases from random attacks to actually going out into the countryside, hunting down and looking for the Viet Cong and eliminating them wherever they exist. And so, starting in the summer of 1965, the Army and the Marine Corps, they begin launching these search and destroy missions, and as well as interdiction missions outside of Vietnam along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This is a covert air campaign that begins early in 1965, and would intensify under President Richard Nixon in 1969 with the secret bombing of Cambodia. But anyway, so American soldiers are increasingly sent out on these missions, these search and destroy missions, where they are sent out to find and eradicate the Viet Cong. Now, again, since this isn't a war to conquer territory per se, this can't be measured in traditional metrics like, towns liberated or territory seized or anything like that. And so McNamara and Westmoreland end up coming up with their own rather grim statistic of how to measure American success on the battlefield at this point. And what they devise is a way of measuring American victory that, in the end, will actually promote the desensitization of American forces towards the very people that they're tasked with defending, and in some cases, end up resulting in atrocities being committed against the civilian population of South Vietnam. Basically, Westmoreland and McNamara begin measuring American progress in Vietnam through engaging in these sending out soldiers, oftentimes ferried in by helicopter, which is why the helicopter, of course, becomes the defining image of the Vietnam War. You always, any Vietnam War movie you see, they invariably soldiers always arrive by helicopter, and that's because of that scattershot nature of the fighting. And the fact that they're literally choppered in wherever they're deemed necessary, dropped into the field, sent in with a week's rations, and basically ordered to search and destroy these groups of VC. And so basically what happens is the government begins measuring, the U.S. government that is, begins measuring success on the battlefield by what they call body counts and kill ratios. So they'll have a press conference and they'll say, we've had a very good and productive period here in South Vietnam. Our forces have achieved a favorable kill ratio of 20-1, and we've killed approximately 500 Viet Cong for the loss of 10 American soldiers or something like that. Obviously, the figures would vary from week to week, but the basic idea was that so long as there was a favorable kill ratio, that more VC and North Vietnamese Army NVA soldiers were being killed by American and South Vietnamese forces week to week, that this represented a way of measuring actual progress in the war, a way of saying that there was, to use a phrase that would come to be very keenly associated with the war in Vietnam, light at the end of the tunnel. Of course, the problem that this creates is that American soldiers, by this metric of measuring victory, are essentially incentivized to kill as many Vietnamese as possible to rack up those kill ratios. The basic rule in the field at this point becomes, for many American soldiers, if it's dead in Vietnamese, it's VC. And a default strategy of, again, declaring free fire zones, search and destroy missions becomes kill anything that moves in many cases. And so as a result, many of the people who were included in those casualty figures that the government begins putting out week to week are in fact civilians in the population that American forces are supposed to defend. Now, obviously, over time, this has a couple of rather corrosive effects on the American war-making effort. The first is that this is enormously emotionally stressful for the American soldiers who are tasked with fighting this war, the vast majority of whom are very, very young and come from the margins of American society. The Vietnam War, as I will outline much more in much more detail in another video, is a racial and class war in a way that World War II was not. Whereas in World War II, you have people like George H.W. Bush, who, was a freshman at Yale when he drops out to become a pilot for the U.S. Navy in the war against Japan. Um, and you have people from those, you know, upper echelons of American society fighting alongside people from, steel towns and, uh, small rural agricultural communities in the South and the West and what have you. You don't see that in Vietnam. In Vietnam, 80% of the people who are sent to fight are people who are from working class backgrounds. A disproportionate percentage of those are minorities. And many of them are very, very young. The average age of the typical American soldier in Vietnam is 19, whereas the typical age of the American soldier in World War II was 26. So those are things that I think are very important when we look at the war and how things eventually shake out. Now, so you take these young people, many of them not as the war progresses and becomes more unpopular, not necessarily willing participants in the conflict, and you add to that the fact that, you know, they're being sent out to defend these villages with people who oftentimes greet them very hostilely. And, you know, they're sent into villages where they're supposed to hunt for VC, and then they might go out half a mile beyond the village and get ambushed. And many of them come to resent deeply the very people that they are tasked there with defending. And that is, again, in many cases, a racialized hatred that is internalized. And so, that's very corrosive to the war effort. But it's also something that leads some people down pretty dark paths in terms of the actions that they take. I think that the general insanity of the American strategy in Vietnam is best summed up by an anecdote from the Tet Offensive in 1968. There was a village that came under heavy Viet Cong attack, was eventually taken by the VC during during the Tet Offensive, the village of Binh Tre, and in the end, U.S. Marines called in air and artillery support to wipe out the VC. When a reporter asked a Marine major about this, his response was, in the course of events, it became necessary to destroy the village in order to save it. Now, of course, that's a statement that's full of contradictions right there. But it really, I think, sums up the conflicted and oftentimes confused nature of the American war effort in Vietnam, and one of the reasons why it becomes increasingly contentious over time. Now, added to this is the fact that the war in Vietnam, beyond the class aspects of it, which disproportionately affect the poor, working class, and minority populations much more so than they do the middle class and the rich. There's also the fact that that claim of victory is not borne out by what people are seeing every day. And by what people are seeing every day, I mean literally what they're tuning in on their TVs every night to see. The war in Vietnam has been dubbed by some the living room war. And the reason for that is because the graphic images of destruction, the maiming, images of dead Americans being, killed or wounded in battle, images of, frightened Vietnamese civilians fleeing villages that have been, burnt up by napalm, of, naked children with severe burns on their backs. These indelible images were brought back to the American public unfiltered by the media, by national media, by both newspapers, magazines, and by television reporters. Every night that the American people turned on their news, they would see these just absolutely horrific, oftentimes quite graphic depictions of what war actually is and what it actually looks like up close, which they'd never seen before. Unlike in World War II, there wasn't very close, um, control exerted on the media and what they sent back to people. Um, Whereas in World War II, of course, it was all very, very heavily sanitized before it eventually reached public consumption. That was not the case in Vietnam, and that was one of the factors that leads to this growing, what comes to be called this credibility gap, this distinct gap between the optimistic, cheerful reassurances of people like Robert McNamara and William Westmoreland that there's light at the end of the tunnel, that things are going great, and the actual, evidence of what's actually going down that people are seeing on a nightly basis and what they're seeing in their living rooms. And all of these things, the lack of clarity of strategy, the emphasis on the wrong means of prosecuting the war in the early phases through air power, and the increasing conflict between American forces and the populations that they were tasked with defending in South Vietnam, all would eventually help foster massive public opposition to the war at home. Opposition that would end up deeply fracturing American society along class, racial, and generational lines, and which would ultimately bring about a sudden shift in political fortunes for President Lyndon Johnson by 1968. And all of those things are what we're going to be talking about in the next video.